And we're going to, fair enough. And we're going to start with Ann Davis. And Ann is from Marist College. Ann, take it away.
Thank you very much. So can you all see my screen?
Yeah, good to go.
All right, let me see if I can put it in slideshow. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I want to say that I have posted my text. And so the PowerPoint is just meant to be some of the key points. So what I am doing in this presentation is to suggest—
And would you like to press slideshow so that it'll scroll full on the screen? Press slideshow at the top.
I can't. There's something at the top of the screen that won't let me get there.
Can you move it? Can you just slide it down? I think it's just the Zoom is hiding it from you.
I wish I could.
Or Ann, how about at the bottom? There's a little slidey thing at the very bottom of the screen. And if you hit the little, the little button right next to that, it'll break out into your presentation mode.
At the very bottom in the right corner.
There you go. Almost there.
Keep going to
That's
the
it.
right. Yeah, there you go. There you go. I'm sorry.
Right.
There it
Thank you very
is.
much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I feel like everything I say is quoting Karol Polanyi. So my question that I want to address today is that correct? So writing in 1944, Polanyi predicted the collapse of the free market and the resort to a collectivist double movement. He pointed out two alternatives, communism or fascism. And he writes about the 30s and the efforts to save the currency at the expense of democracy. And that to me is resonating right now. So there are many discussions about democracy at risk as the market-dominated neoliberalism is increasingly under stress. So none other than Thursday, we had President Biden talking about democracy at risk, calling out for the first time the former president of the United States, who has spread lies about the election and accusing him of not caring about the democracy. And John Meacham, a historian, is calling it democracy's hour of maximum danger. And so it seems like at least some people are ringing the bell of alarm. It's like, where are we in the United States today? And so this theme has been out there for a while. How Democracies Die was written before 2020 by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains, talking about the neoliberal thought collective and its long-term strategy. Yasha Monk on People versus Democracy. David Runciman, How Democracy Ends. Timothy Snyder on tyranny. And Jan Werner Müller has been writing several books on populism in Europe. And so it makes me wonder, where is democracy and theoretically the market freedom, which Polanyi does much to criticize? Apparently the market requirements of violence are now coming to be much more evident. And what he calls the violence of the market may be calling out more violence in political reaction. But besides Polanyi, there are other resources. One person is Paul Starr, who wrote a book recently called Entrenchment, and uses the phrase oligarchy as populism, calling out Trump, the wealthy, claiming to be populist. But he also has other themes, what he calls constitutional capture, again mentioned by Polanyi as well, but Citizens United 2010, Shelby County versus Older 2013, undermining the Voting Rights Act, and then Mitch McConnell refusing to seat Obama's nominee to the court. So we've seen, some resistance already. And another source, Danny Roderick, a political economist at Harvard Kennedy School, has written in 2000 about the political trilemma, how the market itself, especially the global market, puts pressure on democracy. And so he's been writing this quite a while, and again recently. So the discipline of the golden straitjacket, let's say it's the gold standard or whatever, puts pressures on countries to undermine the will of the people if it gets in the way of the global financial market. And so Bretton Woods was a compromise for a while, or what he calls global federalism, where you have a mechanism of reconciling democracy with globalization, but he calls it a trilemma. It's difficult. And so this was, quite some time ago when he's calling this out. And recently, David Autor, economist at MIT, has written about the China shock. And so he has several papers, and quoting others as well, those counties in the US with the highest proportional support for Trump had the highest import penetration from China. So there were job losses, which were not offset by, our market adjustments, which might have included investments in human capital, outmigration, or new jobs, or even new training, which the trade acts are supposed to allow for. And so we've noticed from the work of Case and Deaton and others that health is declining and life expectancy for white males. So there's trouble in the country. And then again, not only recently, but there has been for some time now, the calling out of the neoconservative alliance with evangelicals. So even in the 1980s, it was clear, Michael Lind has written about this, and most recently, Catherine Stewart, about how white evangelicals have been a key support for Trump. And so now we have highly polarized political opinion. It's almost like the two parties are, one is Stop the Steal and the other is the big lie. But social media and cable TV may have played a role in fragmenting and polarizing the public in order to build engagement with their own platforms. And is it true now that information technology and AI are more used to direct advertising and to create a new metaverse? Just wait and see what we're going to enjoy in our own heads pretty soon. But is this where technology is going? And we have a very serious effort by the January 6th House Select Committee, but on the other hand, Fox News is celebrating the Patriots. So is the violence that is inherent in the market and regularly puts human life at risk, as Polanyi points out, is this now being expressed overtly in threats and use of intimidation? With some of Biden's plans now apparently blocked in a highly divided Congress, things like voting rights legislation and Build Back Better with childcare and climate might never happen. And again, I could quote you at length from Polanyi, gridlock favors the fascists. Isn't that happy story? So I'm just wondering, are we on the cusp of another great transformation with populism in Europe and fascism at home, if I can use that word? So President Biden defends, at least claims he will defend, against the dagger at the throat of democracy, but it's not clear how much he's been able to mobilize support about democracy as an issue. And Russia and China are now being more increasingly aggressive and threatening territorial expansion rather than cooperate with US global leadership. And so one of the points that Levitsky and Zyblat make is that fascism comes by the cooperation of one of the leading parties. And here at home, is it going to be that the grand old party will choose fascism instead of socialism? So those are some of the questions I wanted to raise. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. And you've reserved some time, which we can bank with our discussion forthcoming. Natalia, we've got you, for those who are joining, and thank you for being here, we're going to run the papers consecutively and then open up a general discussion. So please take notes as people speak, and then bank your questions, and we'll come to those. The questions, by the way, we're going to handle through the chat function. So the chat is the way that you can register your questions as they come to you. Okay, Natalia, shall we go forward? And shall I try to share your presentation?
Yes, please. Thank you. My computer just collapsed, so I am on my cell phone, and I hope everybody can hear me.
Okay, just a second here. Let me. Okay. And I need one more stroke here, and I think I'm a screen advanced.
Yes.
Here we go. Natalia, just give me a bump when you want me to move forward.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, very well.
Okay, thanks. All right, so the paper that I'm presenting today is about Bernard Marist, and I'm doing a discussion between him and institutional economics to propose local development guidelines. And in this study, I focus specifically in the southwest region of France, Occitanie. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Bernard Marist. So he was a French economist from Toulouse, which is where I'm living now and working for the past couple of years. And he, although he was a professor for several years, his main mission was to spread economic discussion, diffuse it out of academia. So he worked for many years as a journalist, most of the time at Charlie Hebdo, where he actually helped funding this journal, this review. So he died in 2015. And he wrote a lot of books, and I think one of the reasons we are not very familiar with him in the US or even in Brazil, where I'm from originally, is because he wrote a lot. Most of his writing was in French. So if we can go to the next slide, please. He's an admirer of John Maynard Keynes. He did a lot of work also on Marx, very influenced by Adam Smith as well. But he liked combining economics with philosophy and literature. And he had a very particular way of writing that was very provocative and questioning the new classical economic point of view in a very provocative way. And for him, he saw that capitalism had several perversions and that prevented us to live what a lot of French economists talk about, which is a life of being instead of being having a life or living a life of having. And one of the main topics that he wrote about in terms of his academic papers was alternative monetary systems to try to address these perversions of the capitalist system. So one of the few papers that he wrote in English was also actually a paper written with Gilles Dostaler, which is in a book called What is Economics, edited by John Smithin. And we have several monetary economists or economists specialized in monetary policy and theory, like Randall Ray, that is also has a chapter in this book. So, and in this chapter, so I was very surprised actually to see, I became familiar with Marist once I arrived here in Toulouse. I had never heard of him. And then when I started looking for his papers, I was very surprised to see his papers in a book with Randall Ray, who was my professor in grad school. And I have never heard about this French economist before. So I was very surprised and start to doing some research on his work in general. And I thought that he had very interesting proposals that I hadn't heard a lot of them being developed before. So I'm gonna share a little bit how that influenced a little bit my perspective on development. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the objective of the paper is to use a lot of his ideas that is based on this idea that debt is a perversion of our system, because he believes that the fact that debt is that is a result of a commodification and privatization of money, and so it impacts individuals in a very negative way, and also government entities in a way that prevents the government from pursuing public investment and counter cyclical policies, which for Marist, it didn't make any sense that because of this commodification, we are not living a fulfilling life today. So he proposes then alternatives monetary systems in order to avoid these limits that our current monetary system imposes on us. So I'm gonna use some of his ideas to develop this local development guideline towards a more equitable and inclusive society. The way I combine it with institutional economics is that this guideline is based on the idea that we need to reduce the commodification of money, land, and labor. So based on Polanyi's fictitious commodities. So in this work, I focus specifically on Occitanie, but I think that the framework could be applied elsewhere as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit about the region of Occitanie. So it has about 6 million people, which is 1/10 of the French population. It's divided in 13 departments, and it presents a great diversity, both socioeconomically and geographically. So geographically, the region includes 4 big spaces. We have the mountains, the Pyrenees, and the valleys. Then we have 2 sets of plains. And finally, we have the coastal area in the region. Socially, it's also very diverse. we have several departments in Occitanie that are the most rural departments in France, counting on 60% of the population living in rural areas. And then on the other hand, it also hosts 3 of the 10 largest urban French departments, where we have more than 85% of the population living in urban areas. So it's very diverse in that sense. Economically, also, we see a lot of inequality in the region. So last year, 2021, the whole region of Occitanie had a 10% level of unemployment. But some areas had about 60.5%, which was one of the smallest between all French, 88 French departments outside of Paris. And on the other end of the spectrum, there was one department here in Occitanie with 16% level of unemployment, the highest in the country. And then when we look at income inequality, we also see that there is a huge difference with one of the departments here having an income per capita of about 17,000 euros per year, while another department has 22,000 per year, which shows also a great level of inequality for a country like France. I mean, I know when we look for US standards, doesn't seem that different, but for French standards, that difference is very high. Next slide, please. So the idea is in this paper is that, even before COVID, implementing policy in the region was already pretty difficult because of all the differences and diversity across the region. So I came up with this, after reading Marist, I came up with this idea that if we implemented one of his proposals, it would be possible to create a model of development for the Occitanie that could deal with the specificities of the region, even though it's very diverse. So the idea, the proposal of Marist that I'm using is the idea that we could create a local clearing union. So he uses Keynes' idea of a clearing union, but he proposes it to be a localized one instead of an international one, where we would have circulate a currency that does not have a function of store of value, because for him that agreeing again with Keynes, the fact that money has a store of value makes people want to hoard money, and money would hoarding creates unemployment. So he says, well, let's create a local clearing union, and in that way we can have the monetary resources necessary for implementing the local policies that are necessary for responding to crisis, unemployment, etc., in a local sphere. And this is very important in the context of France, where both politically and economically, the decisions are very centralized in Paris. So only 30% of the local government's revenues are autonomous, and all the 70% they depend on the federal government. So the proposal here would be to have this local clearing union, to make it viable employer of last resort program or a job guarantee program for the region. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the idea would be that, I mean, here I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on the employment of last resort. I think that a lot of you in the audience are familiar with this idea that have been greatly discussed by several of our professors from UMKC. So, but the idea would be to use this clearing union to finance, locally finance employment of last resort program. And I think that here in the region, it would be very important because we have areas like Toulouse or Montpellier that are innovation centers based either in the plane building company, Airbus, and Montpellier is very innovative in terms of IT. And with this infotech revolution that we are experiencing right now, we can see here in the region that we have several people that are being excluded from this process of this revolution of the infotech. And several scholars in the area are showing that it's very hard to include and maybe even undesirable to have a large part of the population participating in this infotech economy because it requires constant training. And also, Graeber says creates several bullshit jobs. Actually jobs that do not substantially contribute to society. So given that we have so many people here that are specialized artisans or are specialized in producing agriculture production, the arguments that I make in the paper is that would be undesirable to make these people live their current ways of life to be included in this infotech economy that is very oriented to the economy of having and not of the economy of being. And
Natalia,
then, yes.
If you can wrap it up in a minute or two.
I will. Next slide, please. It's my last slide. So, yeah, so one of the advantages of employer of last resort jobs guarantee programs is that we can design them for other goals that are intended by a community, and this can be done through participatory democracy. And so what I propose here with the commodification of land is to think about projects that would not only allow the populations in the urban areas that are excluded from this infotech revolution to find ways of living and finding meaning in their lives, but also of creating a circular and ecological system around the region of the Occitanie. So to conclude, which is my last slide, what I proposed was based on the ideas of Marist and Polanyi, developing a local development program that is based on the reduction of commodification of the 3 fictitious commodities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn now, thirdly, to Kalpana and Z. Who will start the presentation?
Kalpana.
Kalpana, please go ahead.
Unmute.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you.
Kalpana, you're muted right there. You go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So the title of our presentation is Land, Remittances, and Transnational Household. So we'll be talking about provisioning, nature, and neoliberal fictitious commodities in the context of migration and remittances. So this paper is the third paper from Zdravka and me in the same series. So in our first paper published in 2019, the one we presented in AFI in the same year, I believe, Remittances and Household in the Age of Neoliberal Uncertainty. And the second we presented in 2021, Remittances and Household within Neoliberalism, Triple Movement, right? And this one will be the third one. So all of us are aware of the work of Polanyi, right? In his Great Transformation, he traced the root of capitalist crisis to marketization of land, labor, and money into fictitious commodities. And we extend Polanyi's notion to Nancy Fraser, who in 2013 and 2014, who extended Polanyi's ideas. And she offered a critical theory of contemporary crisis that also encompasses not only economy and financialization, but also environment and society. So in our first paper, we applied Polanyi's concept of fictitious commodity, and we extended that to discuss transnational household in the context of migration and remittances. To explain migration development nexus, which is a model of development finance promoted by World Bank and other international organizations. And so observing transnational households agency on one hand and their precarity under neoliberal uncertainty. On the other hand, in our second paper, we expanded Polanyi's and Fraser's concept from feminist lens. In the second paper, we talked about migration in the context of care labor and how the care workers are working under very precarious condition. And also we explained the notion of transnational household. And in this third paper, we are extending Polanyi's fictitious commodities, his concept of double moment. We extend that to Fraser's triple moment with a feminist extension. And in this paper, not just feminist, but also environmental extension. We talk about the impact of migration and remittance flows to agriculture, ecosystem, real estate, how it impacts the environment and livelihoods. So in these slides, it's almost midnight in Kathmandu and I'm a little sleepy and disoriented, and sorry about that. And in this slide, I'm gonna introduce few concepts like how migration might impact the agriculture ecosystem landscapes in the places where the migrants leave the country. So with migration, right, it introduces, which starts commodification of land, because when people leave behind countries, right, sometimes they sell the land, sometimes they rent out the lands, right? So commodification of land is it leads to change in land pattern as well as tenancy relations also change. And many authors have used these two words to explain the impact of migration on agriculture and land. So with migration, it also reduces supply of agrarian labor. And let me explain what this first, the second, the repeasantization is. So, right, when people migrate, right, when labor migrates to, especially from the developing world, from the global south to the global north, right, they leave the agricultural land behind, right? Sometimes this land, right, so the landless laborer sometimes get access to this land, right? If that happens, right, these people are introduced to the land as sharecroppers. So people who did not have access to land now have access to land. So some of the authors have used this term repeasantization process, right? So because of this, the land that was originally cultivated by farmers, right, now is cropped by the sharecroppers, and the intensification of lands starts happening. Similarly, when land is cultivated by people who are not the original owners, right, the ethnobotanical knowledge erodes, right, because they focus more on commodification process and production for profit, things like that. So that's the repeasantization process. The second is sometimes when migrants, right, they migrate and return with some money in hand, right? So they buy land with remittance in hand, they buy land, but this time for speculative purpose. They want to invest, but in the global south, because the financial market is not so developed, land is the most, people trust to invest in land. So they buy land for speculative purpose, but when people do that, right, they do not cultivate the land, right? So because of purchasing land for speculative purpose, then land is converted, this arable agricultural land is now converted to fallow land. And if that happens, then the sharecroppers, who originally are the people who did not have access to land, right, now they don't have any access, so they become dispossessed. So this is this process is the deactivation process of land, where land just remains fallow. So this, in the development model where remittance is used for financing development, right? So this uncontrolled return of remittances, this continues to dispossess poor from land, right? And disembedding land from social relations, right? This undermines the earlier form of agriculture, and also many countries in the global south are facing, shortage of food scarcity. So this notion of food security is in the verse. And especially during the pandemic, right? Food security has been a big issue. So, and another thing is process of rural gentrification and urbanization. As people migrate, right? You can observe internal migration within the global south. So this process leads to rural gentrification as well as urbanization, right? And this also causes increased demand for off-farm work, right? So agriculture and land is in a crisis. And similarly, when people bring remittances, right, and the financialization process because of remittance, right, when people try to expand businesses through remittances. Some studies have shown that this is also has some environmental impact. So these are a few examples, and Zdravka is gonna explain more. Up to you, Zdravka.
Yes, Kalpana, if you can change the next slide, I will talk about the push factors for migration, neoliberal migration, what we call, but of course, those are very much interrelated to the effects of migration on land that Kalpana just discussed. For example, debt can be a cause to migrate and to remit, but also debt can be sustained continuously over time through remittance labor. Of course, when we survey different cases in different regions and countries, the circumstances are different. So for example, in the context of Eastern Europe, where the population during the socialistic regimes have accumulated kind of a stock of housing and ownership of one or two houses that eventually begin to become unattainable over time during transition, and that in real estate prices grew, especially during the times of more financialization, and that became also a kind of a drive point to immigrate and remit, because the real estate and housing became more unaffordable and unattainable. Furthermore, maintaining through inputs, housing and so on is also a driver. Also, the rural-urban disparities, initially, of course, through unemployment, but also later through real estate and the degradation of the rural areas and moving away, not only for employment, but also generally other commercial activity through to urban cities has been a long process in Eastern Europe, specifically even before capitalism. In fact, this has been a trend, but what is new is this creation of fictitious commodity of land, which was not part of the industrialization process during the socialist time. And so we can find quite a lot of interlinked processes that have to do with the global commodity chains of unattainable or more expensive inputs, of financialization and real estate kind of incentives. One thing that I want to point how we are tying with Polanyi as well as with Pevlin is the emergence of absentee ownership as an institution in the context of that Kalpana discussed, but also in the context, for example, in Eastern Europe. And so to refer to Polanyi, when Polanyi discussed the capitalist development, he actually, with respect to fictitious commodities of land, he actually talked about the colonies that he said are experiencing this process as a kind of compression of time of what took place in Western Europe. One thing with respect to Eastern Europe, it's almost like a super compression, even with respect to the colonies. Before, when we talk about capitalist development and the creation of fictitious commodities, particularly with land. So then the question is, it's very difficult to disentangle the causes from the effects, and there is quite a lot of interconnection, and it's difficult to disentangle, voluntary versus violent or pushed migration. And so really what we are trying to do is to emphasize the cumulative causation in the whole process, and to to see to what extent Veblen and Polanyi especially can explain as a kind of a grounded theory the contemporary capitalist development under neoliberalism. And so these are some of the institutional concepts that we find most applicable and also most useful to see the interconnections in those developments. When we talk about cumulative causation in evolution of landscape, the landscape is not just the land and the ecology, but the space and the social fabric and knowledge, as well as the ways of dominance. To quote briefly Polanyi, when he talked about market in nature, he emphasized that the land and the social fabric and labor are intrinsically connected. And he says to isolate those from and to form a kind of fictitious market of land is the weirdest, perhaps the weirdest of all undertakings of our ancestors. And so, of course, following also on Veblen, his whole discussion of the evolution of capitalism in the context of the United States was the story of absentee ownership. I'm referring to his 1923 book. And then in that discussion, he is describing the frontier and the commodification and not only commodification, but the creation of assets based on absentee ownership. And so basically what we're observing today is this on a kind of a global scale, and also furthermore under neoliberal governance, where the institution of the transnational household has emerged as a major part of the social protection that Polanyi talked about, social protection from state and society. Today is more in the context of transnational households. And so finally,
maybe wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes, I'm wrapping up by saying that, of course, this is the absentee ownership and fictitious commodities are based on the stratification and domination. It also could further stratification and domination. And therefore, the social costs that are produced in these processes cannot be addressed by further creation of further fictitious commodities, which is what I think we are seeing today when we see any so-called externalities being like inequities and deprivations and so on. They are tried to be addressed by creation of more fictitious commodities. And so this is kind of the final concept of social cost that we are tying into all that.
Thank you very much, Zdravka and Kalpana. And we'll now turn a little bit out of order. We're going to ask Luciane Lucas dos Santos. Luciane, please take us away.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm Luciane. I'm a researcher at the Center for Social Studies, University of Coimbra. And I would like to start thanking Professor Natalia Bracarense and Professor Karol Vasquez for having invited me to participate in this panel today. I'm very glad to join you. Having said that, let us start. The title of my speech is The Re-embeddedness of the Economy by Minority Women in the Global South. The perspective I would like to propose has to do with the way we think of the political, and the way a fresh look at it calls for our attention to the role played by minority women in the social change. I particularly focus on the re-embeddedness of the everyday economy by these minority women through reciprocity and community redistribution in their communities as they face the lack of adequate welfare policies. Departing from a feminist reading of Polanyi's work, I argue that inequalities have been insufficiently addressed through an intersectional approach. We should better frame intersectional approaches. Similarly, women's contribution towards resilient communities needs further development in both feminist economics and solidarity economy studies. In this sense, I argue that feminist economics on one side, but also social economy and voluntary sector on the other, should pay more attention to the economic value of other principles rather than market exchange when addressing either inequality or resilience in peripheral communities. In order to demonstrate the potential of a feminist and popular perspective of solidarity economy, I opt for presenting a rural and an urban solidarity economy solutions framed by peripheral and minority women in Brazil in the face of the constraints in the availability of resources or food sovereignty. My argument is minority women have largely contributed to foster resilient communities, an idea that has been crucial in times of ongoing shrinkage of the states all over the world. It does not at all mean that we should be complacent about the state. It's expected to provide us with all public services and policies capable of promoting effective equity, either it be in terms of health, housing, mobility in towns, child care assistance, or fair wealth redistribution. This latter, as the state plays its role as a vector of economic democracy. But as we have seen, resilience might be a key word for more aware and responsive communities. I'm talking about critical thinking and power of choice. To support my argument, I draw on the Polanyian framework as well as on challenging perspective on feminist economics and post-colonial thought. And here I ground my perspective on Zaia Labidin and Sharushila perspectives, and I have worked with Avta Bra and Anne Phoenix, just to name some of them. By questioning some universalized ideas on development and well-being and having in mind a situated analysis, I try to demonstrate that political dimensions of domestic domain has been neglected by the mainstream feminist economics, despite its concern with the economic value of the reproductive work. I also dialogue with the concept of the epistemologies of the South, forged by the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Epistemologies of the South call for our attention to the coexistence of other forms of knowledge, temporalities, modes of existing, and process of sense-making that have been silenced and neglected by the West and their institutions. Alternative solutions created by subalternized groups all over the world have thus been undervalued and assumed as powerless to produce social change. Referring to the previously colonized countries and peoples, it's worth recalling that the concept of South, here mentioned, might also refer to less visible groups in Europe and other spaces understood as being the West. Afro-Europeans, Roma people, peasant and indigenous communities, non-priority citizens from the Western Balkans, for example, citizens with minority ethnic background, Muslim and other minority women, to name but a few. So the first aspect I would like to table is the idea of economic democracy. Generally speaking, we have naturalized economic democracy as a synonym for fighting against poverty. But the achievement of economic democracy requires more than that, as the material constraints that persons and communities might face have deeper roots. And here I draw upon some feminists such as the Indian sociologist Avta Bra or the Afro-American economist Cecilia Rio, who have warned us about the way different asymmetries intersect and feed each other, worsening the situation of inequality. Intersectionality as a feminist theoretical contribution has helped to conclude that fighting for economic democracy implies to identify and combat different forms of hierarchies of gender, race, class, caste, which will produce unequal conditions of positioning, being evaluated by credit institutions, educational system, prison system, local government, and so on, and bargaining power. The symbolic has thus materiality. I would like to invite you all to think of economic democracy in a broadest sense, which means to question the usual bet on development as an affirmative word. It's not possible for us to debate development without paying attention to its neoliberal rebirth, grounded on outside model solutions and naturalized imbalance in geopolitical terms. Besides, as demonstrated by the Sudanese economist Zain al-Abidine and the Indian sociologist S. Charushila, the narrative of development has activated an epistemological trap, that is, the banalized idea of ontological precedence of the West. Having as a ruler Western patterns of what can be considered as well-being, non-Western countries and continents are expected to pursue outside model parameters assumed as universal. We should thus question, why are Western solutions always taken as suitable for everyone everywhere, while indigenous and peasant solutions are assumed as having only local vocation? Over time, some important concepts have been socially declining in significance on behalf of the ideas of large-scale responses and efficiency. We otherwise should reinforce these concepts so that economic democracy could be a feasible goal. I stress three of these ideas, all of them very precious for what we have called the solidarity economy: autonomy, popular knowledge, and the very concept of the political. The fact is that inequality is usually assumed and treated within many public policies as being the same as poverty. However, poverty should be taken as one of the consequences of inequality, that is, the tip of the iceberg. Similar to a many-headed hydra, inequality has color, gender, and social class. Besides, the mutual nourishment between forms of hierarchies has produced material effects, and not only material effects, at a deeper level. Promoting social justice requires creating proper conditions for autonomy, which does not correspond to stimulating individual and competitive entrepreneurship. The autonomy I mentioned here has to do with the sense of community and its contribution to guaranteeing critical thinking, mutual help, and smart mechanisms of redistribution in times of crisis. As known, the capitalist market is not able to provide us with what we need outside the context of a large-scale provisioning. What we have learned from the pandemic is the relevance of an economy of proximity, as well as the capacity of the community to deal with precarious resources. Likewise, the collective alliance toward the rights refines the critical perspectives of the citizens and make them more aware of the community problems. Solidarity economy may forge out-of-the-box solutions with regard to production, consumption, and saving issues. Likewise, community economies, and thus in agreement with what Gibson Grant said about them, solidarity economy is capable of redesigning the ways through which people produce, circulate, and exchange values. It means that it challenges some assertions on the concept of value and the very process of placing it. This stretching condition is also grounded on solidarity economy to forge coalitions, either it be to think the surplus productions in times of the pandemic or create safe options of food provisioning. The second aspect I would like to table here has to do with the political, presenting some examples, especially regarding the role played by minority women. It was Partha Chatterjee, an Indian political theorist and historian, who gave us the clues for thinking of the political in a broader sense. He called our attention to the present everyday resistance which takes place outside the formal public sphere. He thus demonstrated that there is a political dimension in the subaltern groups. Being under the radar, this political dimension has been continuously neglected. The reaffirmation of this political requires, however, other lenses which allows us to detect what can compromise the healthy flow of this political by draining the collectivity's strength. In other words, a narrow view of the social inequality, downplaying the way forms of oppression are intertwined in the urban or rural territories, might jeopardize the analysis on how to overcome hierarchies and promote economic democracy. Many inspiring community-led projects have provided empirical evidence of these agencies' social value. Among them, I recall, for example, the Terra Vista settlement in southern Bahia, in the northeast region of Brazil, which has fostered an agroecology-based popular program focused on guaranteeing food and hydric sovereignty, not only for the families in the settlement, but also for other nearby communities, indigenous communities inclusive. Through a well-oiled cooperation model grounded on reciprocity and redistribution, community redistribution, the Terra Vista settlement stimulates other communities in the region to equally pursue food sovereignty within a networked arrangement. Besides achieving striking rates of environmental recovery within the Atlantic forest, Terra Vista has fostered the diversification of production apart from the cocoa crop, fruits, vegetables, beans, and even unconventional food plants, the punks. It has created synergies between different crops in a way of benefiting from cocoa and fruit processing to trade jams, liquors, handcrafted organic chocolate, and other products. This initiative also highlights the leading role played by rural women and indigenous women regarding global struggles towards food and hydric sovereignty. Due to their engagement with the seeds, the land, and the idea of guaranteeing food for their families, these women have diversified the food production, developed herbal medicines, distributed seedlings, cultivating fruit trees. Another inspiring initiative recognized by United Nations as an innovative solution for housing problems worldwide is the Women Bricklayers Village in Olinda, built by a group of female bricklayers in the 90s. Having had learned a new craft as blacksmiths, tilers, painters, and bricklayers, these women built their own houses through collective work. And had it not been for these women's collective effort over the years, the urban landholding regularization was likely to have never been started. The Women Bricklayers Village in the neighborhood of Peixinhos shows that partnerships between the state and communities are commonly made of peaks and thoughts. It does not at all mean that partnerships should be avoided. On the contrary, state and third sector organizations could provide support to these economic arrangements as well as visibility to them in this non-consensual public sphere. However, the state's responsibility in providing male and female citizens with adequate welfare policies should not be an argument to sustain the minorities' dependence of the government bodies' goodwill and availability. With
Luciane,
regard,
maybe a couple more
okay,
minutes?
just 1 minute to finish the final paragraph. With regard to these organizations, they are known for giving support to community-based initiatives in many dimensions. Their backing could, however, last for a long time if these organizations do not lose sight of their role as supporter instead of a controller. It's important for a people-centered innovation process to be first and foremost constituted by community-led experiences. It leads us to the crucial and final point I would really like to stress here, which is the need for us to be more attentive to the different ways heterogeneous minority women are able to reshape Polanyian principles of economic integration in everyday life, trying to take more advantage from them. They do it by combining these principles in different ways and intensities and fostering different forms of redistributing surpluses. By their economic practice, they can challenge 1. The very specific meaning each principle of economic integration may assume in different contexts, and 2, the very feminist economics assumptions of what is worth being considered as economic. We should be attentive not only to the means by which these women criticize and range themselves against the phenomenon of economic disembeddedness, but also and primarily to the different practice through which subaltern women have creatively re-embedded in this economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciane. Olinda is another example from Brazil, no? And let's go now with John Nicholarsen. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody. Honored and pleased to be a part of this. So thanks for setting it up. Okay, so today, so overview, gonna look at the context and research questions, objectives taken up in the paper, a little bit in the background, get to a critique of money, capitalist money credit form, and get hopefully towards instrumental money credit form, foundations there, then really hoping to trace up the theoretical tendencies, regularities, perhaps some consequences, challenges, and possibilities, and then future research avenues. So this work builds off a dissertation in 2017. It is sort of foundational. So here I'm hoping to kind of distill and extend this, and really wanting to get into kind of money but really sort of economic theory. So I'm going to kind of move briskly, and apologies in advance for that. So the background context was anthropogenic climate change, along with numerous other stressed ecological systems, all pose real and immediate threats to humankind's continued health and existence on the planet. So long-range Earth signaling, technofossils, planetary boundaries. So the research question, are the value, money, and accounting foundations of capitalism able to mediate the transition to a provisioning arrangement that explicitly and inherently accounts for the safety of humankind and the health of the Earth system? Hypothesis is that capitalism as an historically situated provisioning arrangement of unpaid ecological and social costs cannot navigate the transition to a consequence-oriented social dispensation where accounting for human life and scientific technological efficiency are the core guiding analytical principles. So therefore the objective here and before was to conceptualize and contour value, money, and accounting foundations. So in alignment for an alternative provisioning system to address and coordinate humankind's relationship and impact upon the Earth system. So taking as predetermined the core guiding analytical principles. So scientific technological progress, instrumental efficiency, and an a priori humanism. So an intersectional non-invidiousness is what's pretty much meant by that. The contention, no varieties of capitalism or kind of practice socialisms or communism have explicitly looked to fully account for the character of the consequences of their activities and to bring these consequences and inefficiencies into alignment and peace with the Earth system. So therefore, this idea of pax ecologica or ecocentric provisioning, I use those to mean the same. So that an era of ecological peace, and this is self-consciously a monetary production economy. Some of the inspiration behind the work was from K. William Kopp: human life and health have an absolute value. And again, capitalism is an economy of unpaid and social and ecological costs. And then lastly, defense against social costs and losses comes via abandonment of the customary wage system. We'll see that in the value, money, and accounting ideas as well. So big picture, a reminder, sort of Pax Ecologica, the distinct social dispensation, alternately conceived monetary production economy. So goes back to kind of a classically styled wages in advance distribution, so that its income is socially determined from the outset, so before the system. Again, we'll see that in money and the accounting. It's technically distinct, so there's not a capitalist labor market per se, there's a distinct labor form. Some of the, so labor efficacy is the sort of the labor form under the new provisioning arrangement. It's not exchanged against capitalist money, it's exchanged against a different money of account. The results, the framework, so novel value form, distinct money credit form, price system, again, a monetary production economy, distinct measurement indicators, and the non-capitalist market form. So the work and the previous work builds upon and logically and conceptually integrates a theory of value, theory of money, a money credit form, and accounting foundations. So for the value piece, looked at utility and labor theory of value tradition, Marx's labor theory of value, and instrumental theory of value from original institutional economics, and combined those, kind of made an organic offering for theory of value. So an absolute instrumental theory of value. So labor power under capitalism is labor efficacy under the new system. So labor efficacy is the non-invidious ecocentric labor form that is in alignment with the non-invidious a priori humanist principle. So looking at some of the theory of value, sorry, this is a little bit wordy, stick with me, that human life and health are of an absolute value, of a non-invidious a priori humanist value. Therefore, express concern is levied upon any vulnerable and or underserved communities while looking to establish a sustainable social minima, allowing for safe operating spaces for the continuity of life process and recreation of human communities. The analytically, that is absolute non-invidious starting point and social minima is pivotable in compelling spurious, ceremonially encapsulated knowledge and power system towards both habitual and institutional instrumental adjustment, focus upon scientific technological progress, that is efficiency, inquiry, process, distribution, liberation, and implementation. And sort of lastly here, the strict necessity to evolve toward a provisioning arrangement which accounts for the character of the consequences ensuing from the character of production, that is, possesses consequence orientation, that is to account for the unpaid cost in terms of scientific technological efficiencies and externalities. So getting to the critique of the capitalist money credit form, again, capitalism is an economy of unpaid ecological and social costs, and therefore capitalist money credit form cannot carry what it does not account for. So the thinking here is let's actually get serious about designing a money credit form for instrumental, democratic, non-invidious provisioning, which bears a functional relationship to humankind's scientific technological mediation with the Earth system. So there are, we'll just go over 5 sort of critiques here. Capitalist money credit form, that is measuring rod, is precluded from facilitating and coordinating ecological economic provisioning due to the following inherent and insurmountable limitations. We'll go over each. So it is a historically situated artifact that emerged at a distinct time period under social relations that did not and still does not explicitly include ecological dimensions, that is constraints or constants. So right there are different modes of the production of money, and money credit forms are not timeless or universal. It's ontologically constrained, that is, as an historically situated artifact, both the very generation as well as the destruction of the capitalist money credit form fail to inherently and explicitly contemplate and account for the potential social and ecological costs and efficiencies incurred by its use. It is teleologically constrained, that is due to its socio-historical specificity. It is not socially designed for mediating a transition toward a consequence-oriented ecological economic provisioning arrangement, where the core guiding analytical principles are constituted by, again, a priori humanism and scientific technological progress. And it is constrained as to consequence orientation. So it moves, shifts, directs, lays claim to, and otherwise transports ecological assets and human effort, that is labor power, independently of qualitative criteria and the costs and consequences imposed upon vulnerable third parties. It is therefore thus functionally unrelated to the character of the consequences imposed by its use. And I guess lastly, it's notional, reflecting and driving an essentially arbitrary, imputed, discretionary, administered, and or invidious profit-oriented price system, that is a global imputation system, which is not derived from or explicitly related to ecological economic concerns or the Earth system. So towards an instrumental money credit form, an instrumental money credit form would need to reconcile the stated deficiencies above, ontological, teleological. So the goal here is to specify a novel money of account or measuring rod that can carry value through time. The work really does follow chartalist logic, getting money credit form accepted and to function. So money originates right outside of and before markets, requires an authority, often a nation state, but really not necessarily so. The authority here is the Earth system in terms of scientific technological efficiency. There's a performative element, right, in naming. So the Pax Ecologica, the unit of money of account is the ecocentric dollar. ECD, taxes drive money. So the Earth system, in terms of resource signature and resource productivity, levies a tax in ecocentric dollar, right? If one agrees to pay the tax, then they'll go and transact in ecocentric dollars. And this idea of sovereign monetary spaces. So anywhere anyone agrees to transact, use the dollar, there will be a sovereign monetary space. It will drain from the ceremonial system. And if some in a monetary space use the currency, it will still function. And then ontological foundations, the ecocentric dollar is endogenously generated. There's a theory of profits, a theory of surplus value. So we can see really quickly here, resource signature, resource productivity goes into creating a unit of account. It's scientific technological efficiency, along with the labor form, labor efficacy, goes into ecocentric provisioning with the Earth system, creates sort of better relations, creates better resource signature, resource productivity, and then again, sort of more money at the end of the system. So going way too long, I need to skip over kind of the accounting framework. And I wanted to get briefly to the theoretical tendencies and regularities I see as resulting from this. So for institutional economics, again, ceremonial instrumental dichotomy, discrete money credit forms, modes of production of money, price systems, different monetary production economies are possible, instrumental measurement indicators would harmonize national income and product accounts along different lines, promote communal well-being and consumption, increase regional and international planning initiatives, alternative non-capitalist market form has a clear normative contours. So gender as an institution, right? So the social construction of gender is materially and conceptually aligned more with scientific technological efficiency and non-invidiousness. In terms of feminist economics, increases liberation, transformation, and praxis, diminishes sexism, diminishes gender as a cognitive organizer. Care work is remunerated, functions to break down the male-female dichotomy, casts light on overlapping systems of oppression, reduces hegemonic masculinity and kind of the privileged subject, raises standards of living, would smooth the business cycle, impacts on households, protects women from austerity, budget cuts, capital FDI flows, protects from national currency depreciation and devaluations, adjusts propensity to consume, and allows for greater propensity to save, as well as potential for informal saving networks. Implications for time use, data metrics, improvements for women in terms of acknowledgement, redistribution, and representation, would increase ecocentric accumulation, the transition of generation from income from men to women, diminishes ideas of specialization and comparative advantage that are typically found in mainstream accounts of gender. With ecological economics, links to biophysical basis, so in alignment with the focus of ecological economics, evolutionary, interdisciplinary, looks to account for non-human life. Does not attempt to value or price ecosystems, so it does promote cultural ecosystems and cultural ecosystem services. Reframes money. Also, conditional basic income is geographically resource neutral wage, so taxes drive money, keeps it in alignment with sort of a local resource signature and resource productivity.
And maybe wrap it up, John?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. And lastly, we'll just finish here with solidarity economics. Calls for international movement, basically transferring production recipes and humankind Earth system efficiency. Looks to empowers, endogenizes, distributes, and remunerates traditional indigenous knowledge and practices. So communal and collective activity drives harmony and economic ecological balance. Reaffirms connection to nature, place, space, and time. Adjusts household relationship between daily life and the market, and between the state and community. And perhaps a disinflationary force, so conflictual, so would require further solidarity, and then reduces neoclassical and neoliberal notions of methodological individualism and personal responsibility. So I think very sorry for going over. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And you had lots to say, but everyone has really filled our minds. Sorry. And we will now actually ask Karol Gil Vasquez to do that for us before we have the time for some collective conversation. Karol.
Thank you very much, Gary. And I promise to be brief. I think this is more of a report than theoretical discussions of certain ideas. I really appreciate this panel because the last presentation rings a bell in terms of one of my interests ever since I was a graduate student at UMKC, which is money, but money from the sense of reciprocity, or so-called primitive money. And a previous presentation by Professor Lucas dos Santos, which I really am very thankful, because she is the one who kind of opened my mind to the idea of social and solidarity economics. And being an institutional economist, I think this is a great opportunity to bridge between the two with different ideas. And I really appreciate that. So on that note, my presentation is more a report than, like I say, a theoretical discussion. This is field research that was carried out on November 2020, in where a group of scholars from the Autonomous University of Guerrero, a southern state in Mexico, decided to venture in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and it, I guess, a little bit irresponsible from our side, with the support of the Mexican government, to try to learn from the rural communities. The new administration, at least at some point, started to be very, very interested in the ideas of social and solidarity economics. And that's the reason why they have granted some funds for, graduate students and scholars and politicians and community leaders to actually venture into places that they thought they will be the most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But it turned out that it was the opposite, because the urban areas were the ones who were most affected, at least in Mexico. So this is what I wanted to share with this panel, more of like what I've learned, more about the experience, more about how we have to shift gears, because initially we were going to give a workshop on reciprocity and primitive money, or at least that's what I wanted to talk about to the people. And we ended up realizing that we have no clue about people. And then we have to shift our gears to see, to see what they have to say, and to be very flexible in terms of what are we going to learn from, or how are we going to approach what is called indigenous communities. And so this is what I'm going to share with you. And I hope that you find it as interesting as I did, and as insightful as soul opening and mind opening during more or less like 2 weeks of work in what could be the mountains of Guerrero, which tends to be perceived as a very dangerous area.
Yeah.
So here is more all of the paper has been published already. And as I mentioned, this was a project sponsored by the Mexican National Council of Science and Technology. So the money given was directly by the federal government, and the purpose was to study or to learn if Mexico has some sort of base to take off the social and solidarity economics as a way. At the moment, it was as a way to kind of deter the impact of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic. The methodological proposal at the time, which I think it actually took place, it was to carry a focus group, what we will consider in the United States focus group, but instead of workshops, we will carry out or collect data through what they call diálogos igualitarios. And the diálogos igualitarios is basically letting people speak, not collecting data in the sense of surveys or anything, but creating workshops that detach from any form of identity. So I did not come myself as a professor, as an academic, that coming from Mexico City, that teaches in the United States. I came just as a person that wanted to learn from them, and with a couple of trigger questions in terms of how their communities worked. As I say, this field research took place in November 2020. And ideologically speaking, or the theoretical framework was some sort of post-colonial studies, in where we consider, that Mexico is divided between two. We have the Mexico Profundo and the Mexico Imaginario. And in other words, the Mexico Imaginario is the one that has very close to the market, is very close to capitalism. It has benefit from NAFTA. It has benefit from the financialization of the economy, not much different from the US in the sense of class. But then we also have the Mexico Profundo, that represents those who live at the outskirts, who live in the rural areas, who are the migrants, who are the so-called impoverished people, the indigenous communities. But from this perspective, we consider that the Mexico Profundo has other capabilities, not necessarily in the economic sense, but nor in the cultural sense. And that Mexico represents those two contradictions, and the history of Mexico is founded on the struggle between the two. So that's sort of kind of like, where we started. We will consider post-colonial approach to Mexico. And most of the academics who carry out the field research had that in mind. Where we went, it's an interesting part of the country, because it's actually very close to Acapulco, which many of you are, I'm not sure, but I'm just assuming that you are familiar with Acapulco. It's one of the first Mexican touristic sites that it was inaugurated in 1940s. And later on, it has well known for a lot of violence related to drug trafficking. But we were able to visit what is known as common land, or the commons in the sense of, in the theoretical sense. But it's not very far away from the urban area. I mean, I will show you a map more or less to give you an idea where this research was developed. But in terms of legality, in terms of the institutional setting, the land belongs to the people, and the people have entire rights of usage. And if you want to apply the Western concept of ownership, which I think is extremely different in Mexico, but we could argue that the land belongs to the people who live in what is known Cacahuatepec, what I showed you in the map. And so what we actually collected in terms of the data, we collect, like I said, we were very flexible, we were very open. We did not have any specific questions per se. But what I did have in mind in the so-called workshop or diálogos igualitarios is to identify the level of reciprocity that these people actually, I mean, the inhabitants of Cacahuatepec have within the current context of pandemic and neoliberalism actually work with reciprocity, and also their sense of identity. So how their identity shapes their level of reciprocity. That's what I had in mind when, when we were carrying on their dialogues with the people. So allow me just to show you where these communities are located. If I find them in my 10,000 open windows, but I think it's here. So I'm able to find it here. So here is what we will see as the port of Acapulco, in the center part of Mexico City and the big country in the north. And so this is what will be the touristic area. This is the international airport right here. And the area that we were able to visit is you actually take, the Cacahuatepec Commons begins right outside of the metropolitan area of Acapulco. And it ranges all the way to this other highway that is right here. The number of hectares, in terms of hectares, it accounts for 37 million hectares of land that are considered common land. The researchers, we took a road, we took the highway, and we crossed Tres Palos, and we were able to get all the way to somewhere in a point right here, in where we venture crossing the Rio Papagayo, the river, and getting into the inland part of, what will be the Cacahuatepec common land. Visiting different cities or different localities, and trying to actually get to the field observation to later contact the leaders of the communities to schedule the diálogo igualitario a couple of days later after we visit them. Right. It is interesting in terms of the rhetoric of modernization that this entire area is still considered the municipality of Acapulco. So which means that the resources, the resources that the local government is going to have to, work with is going to determine where, if the resources that the municipality is going to determine where they're going to invest it, it's very clear that the municipality of Acapulco has invested most of the resources into the urban areas at the expense of the rural, of the common land of rural Acapulco, right? Which is not news, but we were extremely surprised that this area, even though it's common land, is still considered part of the municipality of Acapulco. And the city of Acapulco in the state of Guerrero is considered one of the most modernized of the state, right? So that we kind of find that interesting setting. So also, I hope that it doesn't bother you that I'm gonna be changing different windows, because I have a couple of pictures and stuff that I wanna show you, so you kind of have more like a clear view of what it was done. So just to share the vision of how the field will look, this is the Rio Papagayo, right? I kind of show you in the map where we were located. And then from there, we cross the river, and then we enter into this inland. If you count in terms of number of hours the drive from Acapulco to this point, it's actually not that far away. I would say it will be like an hour and 15 minutes. And the reason why is that far away is because of the road conditions, not necessarily because of the distance. So we're talking about the closeness with the modern rhetoric, or the urbanization rhetoric is not as far away. So this is sort of the conditions of, which is not news, we have seen this before, but we actually met with people this is another picture of one of the localities that we visit. It's very interesting to note that in most of these visits, women were the ones who were the forefront in terms of discussing the conditions. And of course, men, it looked like there was some sort of centrality in terms of the relationships of power relationships between women and men, and where women have a word to say how the communities are doing. This was in El Cantón, which is close to the Rio Papagayo. And here are, some of the government officials that travel together with the academics. And so that's one of the pictures that we took. And another interesting aspect of these communities is that this was one of the communities that's called La Parota, had expressed the resistance to building a national and a dam at the beginning of the 2000s. And of course, it was extremely controversial because the dam was perceived as bringing jobs, bringing water needed for their harbors, for their fields, for their production of most of it agricultural goods, of course. Nevertheless, the people of the Cacahuatepec common lands resisted the construction of the dam because they were afraid that, of course, they were going to lose their land. And once they lose their land, where else to go? They did not want to become migrants. They didn't want to go and work for the hotels in Acapulco. And as a result, they were able to stop, with their social stand, they were able to stop the construction of the dam. And checking back in terms of the current administration, if they are planning to retake the proposal of the dam, they have decided that no, we're not going to build the dam. And so that generates a lot of controversy because, of course, they need the water because they have a shortage of water despite that the river is next to them, simply because the infrastructure to bring the water to their land is not available. Nevertheless, they are resistant to build the dam, right? So I thought that was also very, very interesting in terms of the learning process of how these communities operate. So what do we actually learn, or how the workshops? There's a couple of videos that, like, if you're interested, I can show it and to you. The workshop lasted anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. We sat with people, and like I say, the questions or the discussion was triggered around identity, and also was triggered around the mechanisms of reciprocity. And as I mentioned before, I was interested because back in the days when I was a graduate student, I was my passion was to learn about reciprocity and primitive money, because in a way I thought that in Mexico Profundo, reciprocity was very vibrant, despite the fact that financialization, of course, has taken over the Mexico Imaginario. So this is what we found out. And in this case, I have, a couple of the paper that was.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you to just take another minute or two.
Oh, yes, sure. My time is up?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so these are the sort of, a table. We built a table with, like I said, there were representatives for every little town. I mentioned what our approach was, and their own descriptions of their towns. So the identity of how they perceive themselves. We were expect, that they will say, we are the backwards, we're not modernized, we are, we're so far away from evolving, that type of modernization development rhetoric. And what we found was actually the opposite. We find, and that's what I call the title, of the presentation, like contemporary rural identity, because at least for this Cacahuatepec common land, the leaders and the people who participated in the Diálogos Igualitarios acknowledge the rural identity as something to be proud of. So in other words, their interest is not in migrating into Acapulco, and also they're not interested into migrating into the United States at this stage, right, in 2020. There were, for the paper, we kind of like organize the adjectives they utilize to describe their communities and themselves. And it's very amazing to see that the majority describe themselves as hard workers, happy people, someone who likes to socialize, someone who likes to help, someone who likes to learn, someone who, that's sort of like in terms of their attachment to what they produce, which in this case was most of them agricultural goods. And also in terms of reciprocity, what we identified that at least those 7 communities that include in the Cacahuatepec common land held religious festivities. And through the religious festivities are where most of these communities interact with one another. And that's where the religious festivities, that's where the exchange and a lot of the trade takes place, right? Which is nothing new. Of course, we know that by the literature, that's the beginning of sort of primitive money ranging there. They utilize pesos. Absolutely, they do utilize pesos, but there's still this sort of debt, eternal debt, or more of a retribution in where the people of Cacahuatepec, the common land of Cacahuatepec, has been able to detach itself a little bit from the urban areas of Acapulco and provides, I would say, self-sufficient lifestyle, if not extraordinary conditions, but still belonging, to Cacahuatepec, and in a way that we could say it's a reproductive level of life. All right.
Thank you.
Well, I'll leave it here. Here are the tables. Here's what the data that we come up. And as I mentioned, this presentation has not the purpose of showing to the audience what field research and if any other ideas come up out of this, I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Appreciate that. And let's enter our period of discussion. We have about 18 minutes, not so much time because we're being held to the strict clock. I would like to actually recognize, I've seen that Ivan has had his hand up, Vasquez, and Anne has put a question into the chat. But before I turn to those two, I'd like to actually just mention that last night, Randy Ray got an award for his scholarship and his writing, which has been so influential. And he shared a nice moment that he and I had a long time ago. But I wanted to mention that what we have today, I believe, is solid evidence of Randy's inspirational teaching at UMKC in the profound work that's been done at that institution, because we can see that the ideas drawn forth here are both very original, very provocative, and they carry the mark of the interaction and dialogues that have undoubtedly been happening and continue to happen at UMKC. So wanted to congratulate my friend and colleague. Ivan, you had your hand up. Would you like to maybe unmute yourself and state your question? And then we'll turn to Ann Davis's question. Oh, Ivan says it was a mistake. In that case, let's start with, we had mentioned at the beginning that people could maybe put their questions into chat. If you find that that's not so easy, then put up your hand, we'll do it that way. Anne has a question in chat for Karol, asking what is the status of these commons? This common, does it have a legal standing in Mexico, such as ejidos?
Yes, actually, the ejidos is different from the ejidos, right? So in the ejidos, there is some sort of title of the land that representative, usually they call it a cacique, of a representative of the community will help in behalf of the people. The commons is not. It does not have per se the title of the land because it's held in community, right? So it's interesting, and one of the things in my dissertation back in the days as a graduate student I haven't touched ever since 2000, I don't remember when I graduated, but I haven't touched it, is that ever since colonization, common land was respected in Mexico, in the Mexican territory. What's now the Mexican territory used to be the New Spain. And there were, of course, there were some sort of subtraction of the common land, through different historical periods. And mostly the Catholic Church ended up owning most of the common land. But then with the revolution of 1910, the common land was given to certain communities. And there were all these other legal statutes being created to respect the common land in Mexico. So I think this applies to a lot of countries in Latin America.
Thank you for that. I'm not seeing anything quite yet in the chat, and so let me just pose a couple of quick questions to our speakers, and do come forth, either raise your hand or do that. Anne, you talked about, first for Anne, you talked about, is another great transformation coming? And if you could say a couple of words, it seems that you were thinking with some fear about that. And of course, the violence of the market, your concept it seems to be actually the violence in the, if we think of the Polanyian duality between market and community, that this fracture inside what he might have said idealistically a community is something very crucial. Just a comment or a question for Natalia, which is that the kind of thing that you're trying to put together in Occitanie is reminds me a little bit of circular economy based on exchange and the ability to exchange and to detach from the system, the monetary system, to redefine that. That's something that actually has been an ongoing aspect of the work that we're seeing here in Yorkshire as well. But in some sense, can we use circular economy principles, and are there then exchanges between the agricultural and the professional workers that we could really imagine? And then I'll finish with the third question for Kalpana and Z, which is basically, in some sense, our other speakers are giving examples of the solidaristic solutions, the complexity of that, and then the construction and sometimes precariousness of that. You take an example of people building and working across borders in the way that that's destroyed and caused the reconfiguration of communities in ways that actually have been abusive of the land that people came from. And of course, your characterization of as complex is completely warranted. And I feel like I'd like you to really dig more into that, because I find that my own understanding of remittances is really dwarfed by the nuance that you've brought to the picture. So could we ask, maybe, if seeing no other hands, Wolfram's hand is up. So Wolfram, go ahead and state your question too, please.
Okay, it's more a comment to Karol, just mentioning that the idea of reciprocity has much more substance in institutional economics than most institutionalists even know. It goes back as far as John Fact Foster's, one of his big three principles. It's just the mechanism is recognized interdependence, right? And the recognized interdependence, as far as we have it, then we realize the reaction to our actions, adequate or inappropriate, whatever. So it has a dimension of cognitive capacity and of group size. How many people can do that? How large can the commons be? It reaches from John Fact Foster to Paul Dale Bush's theory of institutional change. I have tried to formalize it in a 2012 JI paper, and it has a huge dimension in all kinds of formal models even. So I just wanted to to give a hint to the deep dimensions and broad dimensions of the term reciprocity. That could perhaps in another paper be a bit more theoretical foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got actually 10 minutes left in the session, and we know they're strict. So could we maybe share it a couple of minutes each for our speakers going in order, just to make some final observations, and apologies for the limits of time. Anne.
Thank you very much for the question. I was very gratified that several of the panelists mentioned Polanyi, so it seems like his work is still relevant to today. In terms of transformation, yes, I am anxious because I don't see an easy transition to the wonderful examples of solidarity community that were mentioned here. So if we could magically take the models that you all have presented and say, yes, that's right, let's do it. I just don't see it happening, partly because of the way capitalist money still works, and partly because the nation state relies on currency, which does quite the opposite, compels people and destroys the environment. So I think war is more likely than alternatives, although I would love to be wrong. And I hope perhaps you all could comment on that.
Thank you. And Natalia.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why these workers that would be in a circular economy would not, or part of the population would not interact with the infotech population. We see here already in France some installations of gardening belts around urban towns to try to, and some of them are already financed with local currency that are being created not by the government, but through private initiatives of individuals in the area. There is a town not far from Toulouse called Albi that their goal 5 years ago they set up, but this is by the local government, they set up a goal of being autosufficient for agricultural products and food, and they had just achieved that goal in 2020. What I see is if the clearing union is created in the way that Marist thought about it, it wouldn't necessarily be a system that is substitute for the current system, but more complementary, and that could work as a buffer for whatever the capitalist system is not the labor supply that the capitalist system is not absorbing. In terms of Anne's question, I mean, I also see a lot of pressure and crisis and potential war, especially given the scarcity of resources that we are facing, that I think we are going to really have to address these questions. I mean, as someone, I mean, we just don't know where this is gonna turn, right? And as we don't know, we do need to, I think our role in the university as academics and policymakers is to try to think about alternatives. So.
Thank you very much. Kalpana and Zdravka.
So first of all, I noticed that like connecting all the dots between different speakers, right? So the neoliberal solutions that were proposed in different geographies, right? All of us are talking about different countries, different situations, right? Looks like all of the context are talking about some alternatives to neoliberal solutions that were not working, right? And in the context of our own paper, because of the wage differentials, workers are moving from the developing countries to the developed countries in the global north, right? When that happens, social fabric matrix is breaking down in the migrant sending countries, and this remittance as a way to finance development. This solution is not working. And especially, you know, in the aftermath, we are still in the pandemic, but in the aftermath of the second wave of the pandemic, right? Many of the countries in the global south are realizing how volatile, how precarious, right, these economies are, especially when you rely on some other economies to run your own economies, right? So, yeah, next, like, you know, the next transformation, right? So everyone is wondering what's the next solution, and maybe solidarity economy, local economy, maybe that's the direction we need to head to. Zdravka.
Thank you. Zdravka.
I will leave my time to the rest of the speakers, although I have a lot to say too.
I no doubt, I'm sure you do. Luciane.
Thank you. Well, about the final message, I think that it's important to reframe some assertions on Polanyian thought. For example, the relevance of the household for Polanyi. We haven't discussed this perspective, and we have emphasized other economic principles, and I think that we should pay more attention to the household. Secondly, the need of thinking redistribution as being something more than a state role. The community redistribution has been neglected in economics and in feminist economics as well. The third aspect, the need of being attentive to the diversified ways in which minority women have challenged theoretical and epistemological assumptions of what is relevant regarding everyday economy. I think that we should pay attention to that, not only as examples, but also as theoretical and epistemological perspectives to be taken into account. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John.
I too will cede my time to others.
And that,
Thank you.
That means that we'll turn with the final thought to Karol Gill.
Well, thank you for granting the time. I appreciate it. I will continue my call of postcolonial studies. I agree with Anne. There is one side of the world that is ending into severe crisis. War could be the fascism, for sure, by politics, no doubt. But there is another part of the world that has solutions. It's just a matter of us learning from them. I think that without, you know, we're so used to see them as, you know, the agents of change, the clients of development. I think in a positive note, you know, that gives us more hope. And you know, but I know it's challenging to see, you know, what's the relevancy of their discourses. And I think in the United States, the discourse is there. Unfortunately, it's embedded into violence too. But we have a lot to learn from Native Americans. We have a lot to learn from indigenous communities. We have a lot, not just as, you know, folkloric in a racist form, you know, but more about like Professor Dos Santos is what they think about money, like how do they confront development, all those big questions as institutional economists. I find that super interesting ever since I remember. So that would be my positive note on acknowledging that there is some negativity in the air right now.
Thank you. And I'd just like to mention that, Luciane, I appreciated your insight that development and underdevelopment and these words are in every place, in every space. And I myself am inspired by the people in the community in Leeds and in Yorkshire, working together outside of that formal system, working with each other. They want Leeds to be a compassionate city and are seeking ways to make that happen, despite in many cases being marginalized. And This is something that we can see has dimensions around the world and ways to connect each other with anything like the force that global capitalism has in connecting us through the monetary system. This is something where we are going to need some of those insights, John, as we figure out how to move both within regions, within communities, and then across them. Thank you, everybody. We've got a little bit of a break, and we will have a session, another session of AFI and others, of course, in, I guess, exactly 15 minutes. Thank you so much for a wonderful session.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.